Well, hello. It's the last Sunday of August 2021, and so we had a nice breeze kick up out here, even though it is August, and so I'm very thankful for that, and I figured I'd come out and try to shoot a video on chapter 47 of Genesis. So, I think what we'll do is pray and read through it, and I just have one sort of overarching theme that's kicking around in my head today. So I'll save that for the end, but I'll talk about the details, make sure we're all clear on that as we work through this chapter. Sort of an interesting one to think about. So let's do that. Let's ask God to help us. Lord, we do indeed ask you to help us as we seek to handle your word in a way that is appropriate. I pray that you would keep away all error and vain speculation, and that you would reveal to our hearts the truth that your Spirit would have us learn. We ask in Jesus' name, amen. All right. There's some construction noise a couple of houses down, so I think we've got the computer pointed away from it, so we'll see if it's overwhelming or not. I guess I thought it was good weather too for being outside. Genesis chapter 47. It's funny, some days I can still read all right, and other days, like today, it's as blurry as a very blurry thing. So I need my glasses today. All right, there it is. Chapter 47. Then Joseph went and told Pharaoh and said, "My father and my brothers, their flocks and their herds, and all that they possess have come from the land of Canaan, and indeed they are in the land of Goshen." So Joseph's father is Jacob, also known as Israel, the progenitor of all Israelites in history. And Joseph's brothers, along with Joseph, are the patriarchs or founding fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. So you have the entire nation of Israel. It's a baby nation right now. It's like a seed. It's only 70 people or so. It has been transplanted through God's actions from the promised land down to Egypt. And Joseph says they're in Goshen. Goshen is on the east side of the Nile, and most of Pharaoh and the Egyptian nobility, at least, are on the west side. So they are there now, and Joseph is arranging an audience before Pharaoh. Verse 2, "And he took 5 men from among his brothers and presented them to Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh said to his brothers, 'What is your occupation?' And they said to Pharaoh, 'Your servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers.' And they said to Pharaoh, 'We have come to dwell in the land, because your servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants dwell in the land of Goshen.' Then Pharaoh spoke to Joseph, saying, 'Your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is before you. Have your father and brothers dwell in the best of the land. Let them dwell in the land of Goshen. And if you know any competent men among them, then make them chief herdsmen over my livestock.'" So the first thing that happens is Joseph just picks 5 of his brothers and brings them in. That's kind of interesting. It doesn't say which 5, so I guess you could maybe try to guess, but I don't know. And why does he do that? Well, Pharaoh is a busy man. Okay, he is the ruler of the most powerful nation on earth, and so Joseph doesn't want to overwhelm him. He just wants to have a quick audience with Pharaoh, so Pharaoh can welcome his brothers to the promised land, and they can talk briefly. And so they have arranged to stay in Goshen, and Pharaoh says that's fine. And then Pharaoh offers them government jobs, right? He says, by the way, um, you know, me, Pharaoh, I own a lot of livestock too, and so if you got some really good livestock herders, you can come work for me if you need to. Okay. Then, and only then, does Joseph bring in his father Jacob. So let's see that in verse 7. Then Joseph brought in his father Jacob and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to Jacob, "How old are you?" And Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years." He was 130 years old. "Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." So Jacob calls 130 years few and evil. Okay, and I guess the most recent years of Jacob have been somewhat evil when he presumed that his beloved son Joseph had been killed by wild beasts. But he's pretty happy now. He escaped a famine and found out his son is alive and is doing very well. But he is right in that, for instance, Isaac, I believe, lived to 180 years. And Abraham also lived, I can't remember, but I want to say close to 200 maybe. Maybe a 175 or something like that. So, of course, Jacob's not dead yet, but he is right. The lifespans are declining of the patriarchs here. So that's his answer to Pharaoh. And then verse 10, Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. And Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramses, as Pharaoh had commanded. So they get sort of their pick of the eastern side of the Nile River, okay, which is apparently was mostly fields anyway. It wasn't where the cities were, but at least they got their pick because Joseph enjoys the favor of Pharaoh and all his officials. So this is a perk that Joseph gets for saving the country, right, through his interpretation of the dreams that God gave to Pharaoh. Verse 12, Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread according to the number in their families. Now I think that that's an important verse, and I'm going to bring it up again at the very end. But notice it does not say that Pharaoh provided for Joseph's family, Joseph's father and brothers. It says that Joseph provided for them. So let's see if you think that makes a difference at the end of the chapter. Verse 13, Now there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. Do you know what languished means, right? It's like, I'm so hungry. That's languishing, all right? And Joseph, verse 14, gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. So when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, Give us bread, for why should we die in your presence? For the money has failed. So what does this mean, Joseph gathered up the money? Well, he didn't go out looking for the money. The money came to him. What Joseph had that no one else had was, earlier we read, he had an uncountable amount of grain that he had stored for the 7 years of plenty. Okay, you might say, why didn't everybody store? Well, I think we talked about this before. I think Joseph uniquely knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that those 7 years of famine were coming. Okay, and so he was very diligent to prepare, and most of the rest of the people, they might have saved a little bit, but certainly not enough to get them through 7 years of famine. So now we're only in what I think a year 2 or 3 of this famine, and still more to go, and everyone's run out of food except Joseph, who is the agent of Pharaoh. So basically the government has the food because the government planned ahead. Okay, um, Joseph has stored up, and he bought the food, right? Um, Joseph, using Pharaoh's wealth, bought the food when it was at a very low price for practically nothing. Probably a lot of people said, I mean, the rice was as common as dirt about probably, and or whatever they were growing. I'm assuming it's rice. So sure, I'll sell you some. And Joseph bought as much as he could, right? And everybody thought, well, that's kind of weird. It's overkill, okay? But now it's worth more than gold, as we have seen, okay? So people have come, and the price keeps going up and up and up, the market price for food. And finally, when it says Joseph gathered all the money, literally anyone who had any money had spent it all buying food from Joseph, okay, from Pharaoh's household. So Pharaoh has collected all the money. And isn't that interesting? Think about, I'm sure there were rich people in both Canaan and Egypt, that very rich people, besides Pharaoh, that had just come off of these 7 years of abundance, and I'm sure they had lots of silver and gold, and I bet they thought they were set for generations, okay? And then the famine hits, and they were probably okay for the first year. And then the second year comes, and ooh, now it's getting really tight, right? And then the third year comes, let's assume, and now there is no food, right? So the price is just going sky high because you can't eat gold. You can't eat it. Can't eat silver, can't eat gold, can't eat copper. And so when you're hungry, those things eventually become worthless, okay? And isn't that interesting that people who thought they were rich because they had lots of silver and gold, God was able to make them poor by depriving them of the most basic elements of existence, just food to eat. All right? If you think about food, we are very dependent upon God for food, even today. Farmers, of course, recognize this by, farmers pray often, I think, for rain or for the right weather or less rain or whatever, because they can see immediately the effect that the acts of God and the weather have on their food. But so do you and I. Okay, there are farmers all over the world growing food very efficiently, and then we buy it. But what happens if something like this happens, right? I don't have a victory garden in my backyard, and so what happens if the price of food suddenly skyrocketed? It doesn't matter how much I have in the bank. Nobody's going to sell me food because they have to eat too, right? So we're all dependent. You can't store most food indefinitely, although Joseph did. He stored grain. But most people don't do that, and we just, food spoils after a while most of the time, and so we just sort of assume that there's going to be enough food around where there'll be enough for us, or there'll at least be enough where we can buy it at a reasonable price. But God illustrates here to the whole world that in the blink of an eye, the people that thought they were rich actually had nothing. Okay, and now they do have nothing. All their silver and gold is collected in Pharaoh's household. So now the people say the money has failed, right? They come to Joseph. It almost kind of sounds like there's some civil unrest about to brew here, which you would expect, actually, right? If you were about to starve to death and you were broke, would you just say, well, them's the breaks, and lay down and die? I think, especially if you had people you loved that were depending on you, I think you would start to think about desperate measures, right? And so, in verse 16, Joseph says, "Give your livestock, and I will give you bread for your livestock if the money is gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them bread in exchange for the horses, the flocks, the cattle of the herds, and for the donkeys. Thus he fed them with bread in exchange for all their livestock that year. So now Joseph says, you do have something of value. You have your animals still that have not starved to death. Okay, you've run out of food for them, and you've run out of food for yourselves. So I'll buy them. Okay, I'll give you food and take ownership of your animals. Now, do you think Joseph built a giant pyramid and filled it with all the animals in Egypt? No, those wouldn't have. He had no use for that many animals because there's nobody to take care of them. And where would he house them and everything? The animals were already spread out in a good spot for themselves. Just Joseph took ownership, or Pharaoh actually took ownership. Joseph acting in his behalf. Joseph took ownership of the animals, but the animals still stayed with their previous owners at those houses and farms and things because they could feed them, right? So Joseph said, I'll provide food for you and your animals, so your animals won't die, you won't die, and I just own your animals now, okay? When this is all over, they're mine, all right? And you might say, why would somebody agree to that, right? Your animals are your livelihood. Well, it's either that or starve, okay? Or riot. And, I'm sure Pharaoh's army was all well fed from the stores from Joseph's planning. So I think this was the best option, okay? Joseph said, I'll just legally take ownership, or Pharaoh will, of your animals. How about that? Verse 18, when that year had ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, we will not hide from my lord that our money is gone. My lord also has our herds of livestock. There is nothing left in the sight of my lord but our bodies and our lands. All right? So now they realize they've come to the end. All they have is their very homes and the land, which they apparently owned. That's important, I think. And, of course, themselves. Right? You might say, how could somebody sell themselves? You could sell yourself as a slave. Okay? That's always been an option throughout history. In most cultures, if you got really desperate, you could go to somebody that had money and said, hey, keep me alive, you pay me food, and I'll be your slave. Okay? And that's what they're offering now. All we have is our land, our family homes, and our actual selves. Verse 19, why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land will be servants of Pharaoh. Give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land may not be desolate. This is actually a very good argument by these people. It's very convincing and compelling. They say, look, if we all die, if we all starve to death, you're Pharaoh, but of what? Right? You won't have any subjects left. And more importantly, your land will start to become uninhabitable again, right? There'll be all kinds of wild plants grow up and wild animals spread everywhere, and the whole nation of Egypt will go backwards to what it used to be, just a big swampland basically on either side of the Nile. Then the Egyptians had worked for centuries to make it a very, very productive farms and things like that. And they said, at least for the sake of this nation, right? You need bodies being out working in the field. So please buy up our land and buy us, right? In other words, feed us. That's all they wanted. They wanted food. Feed us, and you will own the land, and you'll own us going forward. We will be your servants. Okay. Verse 20, then Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. You might say, didn't Pharaoh already own the land of Egypt? No, he didn't. Apparently there were certain rights that the landowners had, that even though Pharaoh was the king, he could not usurp their rights in certain ways. Okay, this has always been pretty important because people work harder when it's for themselves, right? Maybe we'll talk about that in a minute. But up until this moment, Pharaoh did not own the land, but now he does. Pharaoh literally has bought up all the land. That would be like the government coming to you and offering you money for your house and your land. It's saying you could still live there, but that you had to, that if you wanted to, right, they give you a whole bunch of money and you could buy it and then you sold it. And in this case, the government is rich enough, because they're the only ones that have food, to do this. So that's a startling development in Egypt's history, is this moment when Egypt goes from thousands, if not millions, of landowners to almost just one Okay, that Pharaoh now literally owns the land through a legitimate business transaction, and he owns the population. All right, they become his slaves. They become his property. Okay. Verse 20, that Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every man of the Egyptians sold his field, because the famine was severe upon them. So the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he moved them into the cities from one end of the borders of Egypt to the other end. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had rations allotted to them by Pharaoh, and they ate their rations which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their lands. It says he moved them into the cities. He didn't move them all into the cities, obviously, but now Pharaoh could say, you know what, this area over here doesn't need as many people, so we're going to move them into the cities. This city over here may have too many people, so let's shift some of them. If Pharaoh owns you now, he can tell you where to go live. Okay, he can move people around for the benefit of the whole country. So he starts doing that. And then it says that he did not buy up the land of the priests, and I think that's also important, but we'll talk about that at the end. Okay. Right, the priests weren't farmers even before, so the priests always provided a service in exchange for money which they could buy food with, right? And so the deal they had before the famine even was, if they are a governmental priest, which they were employed by the government to minister to the people on behalf of these Egyptian false gods, then they received a salary from the government. And since the government, in this case, did not go broke at all, they continued to receive their salary, okay, in food. And so they were not in danger of starvation. They didn't have to sell their possessions. They didn't have to sell their land or themselves. So what is preserved is a small class of people associated with the priesthood in Egypt that stay independent and have not actually sold themselves into serfdom, we would say, to Pharaoh. I think that's important. All right. Verse 23, Joseph said to the people, indeed, I have bought you and your land this day for Pharaoh. Look, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. It shall come to pass in the harvest that you shall give 1/5 to Pharaoh. 4/5 shall be your own as seed for the field and for your food, for those of your households, and as food for your little ones. So the deal is, says Joseph, Pharaoh owns you, your land, your livestock, everything. But you can just keep on living as farmers. But from now on, 20% of your harvest goes to Pharaoh. And you can do whatever you want with the rest of the 80%. That's the deal. Okay? You might say, boy, that's a pretty rough deal. Well, it's not a rough deal if, actually you and the land and everything belong to someone else, right? That's actually a very good deal, right? If somebody stopped you on the street and said, hey, I own this big mansion and this big estate, and I have all these possessions. I want you to go take care of it and work on it and make it keep producing, and you can keep 80% of whatever you raise. That would actually be a very good deal. You'd have zero investment in it, right? So let's see what their reaction is. Verse 25, they said, you have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. So they said, that sounds great, right? And Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day. To this day? To which day? Well, who wrote this? These are called the books of Moses. All right, so all the way down to the Exodus for 400 years from this story later, this arrangement has stayed in place. I think that's important too. Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt to this day, that Pharaoh should have 1/5 except for the land of the priests only, which did not become Pharaoh's. So Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen, and they had possessions there, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. It says they had possessions there. So I'm going to spoil my point here just a little bit. Wait a minute, didn't we say that nobody really had any possessions? They'd sold everything to Pharaoh? Well, who didn't sell their stuff to Pharaoh? The priests, the people associated with the priesthood, the priests and their families. Who is Joseph married to? Joseph is the son-in-law of one of the head priests. I think Joseph has married into the priestly class. I certainly think that Pharaoh considered him to be a priest of the Hebrew God, okay, that had interpreted these dreams, all right? And so I think Joseph benefited from this arrangement. Joseph was drawing a salary too. Joseph didn't have to sell anything of his. He had his own personal wealth that he got from Pharaoh for doing this job, for being second in command in the whole country. And he had his own house with his household, with his sons and his wife. And as the famine got more and more, Joseph himself did not have to sell what he privately owned. He was part of that priestly exception, I believe. And you see, now that's why it's important that Joseph in verse 12 provided for his family over in Goshen. The Israelites themselves, who were living a very simple life, they also did not have to sell themselves legally to Pharaoh and become his property, because Joseph was providing for them directly. Okay? And that's why they had possessions. Plus, I'm sure God was blessing them during this time. So anyway, I think that's very important, that the Israelites were not swallowed up like the Egyptians were in this change of how they ran the country. They stayed distinct. They had their own private property still. They had their own land, which had been deeded to them, granted to them by Pharaoh here. And their income that they needed to feed themselves and their livestock was coming from Joseph, who had a guaranteed salary from the government. I might be wrong on that, but I think that's why these verses are put in here. What do you think? And I think that's very important for what happens on down the line. Okay, that the Israelites never do become property of Pharaoh. Okay, and so when the pharaohs later on act as if they are his property, it's not true. Okay. Verse 28. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. Remember, he was 130 when he came there. So the length of Jacob's life was 147 years. When the time drew near that Israel must die, he called his son Joseph and said to him, "Now if I have found favor in your sight, please put your hand under my thigh and deal kindly and truly with me. Please do not bury me in Egypt." Do you remember when Abraham sent his faithful servant to go back to Haran or Paddan Aram to find a bride for Isaac? He told his servant to put his hand under his thigh. So I don't know exactly how that works, but in other words, this is a solemn oath here that Jacob is having Joseph to take. And he says, "Don't leave me buried here in Egypt," or he says, "Don't bury me in Egypt. Let me go back and bury me in that cave with my fathers, with Abraham and Sarah and Isaac." And so in verse 30, he says, "But let me lie with my fathers. You shall carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burial place." And he said, "I will do as you have said." Then he said, "Swear to me." And he swore to him. So Israel bowed himself on the head of the bed. And that's the end of chapter 47. So I think that's self-explanatory. Jacob has an expectation that his descendants will return to this land, and because of that, he not just because his ancestors are buried back in Canaan, I think, but because of the expectation that the nation of Israel will return, he wants to be buried back in the Promised Land. And Joseph says, "Yes, I'll do that." So like I said, we've kind of hinted at all these things already, because we kind of had to as we worked through, that this is a point in the history of Egypt where everything changes radically. Basically, after this is over, what we have is communism, in a way. I guess it depends on how you define it. But what Joseph is doing on behalf of Pharaoh is he's looking around for who is about to starve to death, and he's providing them food from the common treasury. And there's no such thing as private property anymore. The government owns everything, and the government's making all the decisions about where people live, what their job is, how much food they get. And that ends up saving these Egyptians' lives. So it was a good thing that this happened here. What? You're saying communism's good? Well, who's the leader that is implementing communism? It's Joseph, okay? And who does Joseph fear? Joseph fears God. Joseph is a man of integrity. So if you had God-fearing leaders at the top of any communist regime that are making the decisions, then of course it would benefit everybody. It would be wonderfully effective. But we've never really seen that, okay, except for right here, okay? We see communism being used by the apostles, right? Those are God-fearing men for sure, in the New Testament on a voluntary basis. In other words, they weren't going out and saying, hey, you don't own that anymore. But as people joined the church, they recognized the apostles' authority and wisdom, and they turned over their possessions to them to use as they saw fit. And the church was blessed tremendously. So what I am saying is it's never really the system. You can't say one system is holy and one system is broken. Maybe you can, but what we actually find when we look at history is if you have God-fearing people in positions of power, everyone benefits. And if you don't have that, everyone suffers. All right? So if you're someone who says, our democracy is breaking, and or our republic, or whatever you want to call it, it's not really breaking. Okay, it's doing exactly what it's supposed to do. It's we're getting leaders that reflect the population. Okay, we're getting godless leaders that don't fear God, and the country is suffering for it. Our country, America, that's what I'm talking about now. But the reason we have those leaders is because we have a more and more godless population, right? Well, whose responsibility is it to share the gospel with their neighbors so that they will not be godless, so that they will fear God? It's the church's responsibility, right? So the problems with America, I believe, are the direct result of the church not doing what it's supposed to be doing, and everything else is just happening naturally. Okay, I think our system of government is still working just as it intended, but our founding fathers assumed or hoped that we would remain a Christian nation due to the influence of the church. Okay, and the church has gotten fat and lazy. Okay, and we've said we've got ours, and everybody else can fend for themselves, and the population has decayed. Okay, and the church has decayed right along with it. So, was that what I wanted to talk about? Not really. What I wanted to point out was a key verse from Hebrews 7:7. That's pretty easy to remember, isn't it? Hebrews 7:7. Let's see. Hebrews 7:7 says, "Now it is without controversy that the lesser is blessed by the better." I think that's what it says, okay? But I'm not going to turn over. The main thing is it says, if there's blessing going on, the superior guy is the one blessing the inferior guy. That's what Hebrews 7:7 says. And it basically says everyone, that's obvious to everyone, right? And did you catch it? Who blessed whom in this chapter? Twice, as a matter of fact. In verse 7 and in verse 10, at the beginning of their meeting and at the end of their meeting, Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Not Pharaoh blessed Jacob. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. And I think that ties into everything that we've been talking about here. I think that that when God had this shift in the Egyptian social framework, right? He kept the Israelites out of it. Okay, God was above the plans of Pharaoh. Okay, and he kept his people from engaging in this transaction. And whoops, lost my place here. And we see here that Jacob fully intends, right? He's looking forward. He knows that they're going to come out of this land. And we see here that even though Pharaoh has the power in our story, and he's buying up everything, and it's turning into the ultimate tyranny, really, God is above that, okay? Working, and the nation of Israel, in the form of Jacob and his descendants, are superior to the mighty nation of Egypt. Okay, and we see that illustrated when Jacob blesses Pharaoh. Was Pharaoh aware of all this? I think in some sense he had a sense of it. Right, he certainly submitted himself to the judgments of Joseph in deference to the power of Joseph's God. But anyway, I thought that was quite startling. And then to see Jacob blessing Pharaoh, and then you see these little hints of God preserving and protecting this little nation of Israel, even while the famine continues. So, further application for today, I suppose we could say, right? If you're looking around and reading the news, which you don't need to do too much of, but the important events will get to your ears whether you're seeking them out or not. And if you are getting discouraged, right? Like, what was the news back then? Looks like another year of famine, everybody, right? The bad news kept coming. If you're discouraged, remember, God is always in control, and he's doing things that will ultimately benefit his people. Wow. Right? Amen. The question is, are you one of his people? Right? And if you're not, you need to look to him, as Pastor Paul said this morning. Look to Christ in faith. That's all you have to do. Look to him. Don't put your faith in money, in bread, in anything else. Look to him. Beg him to save you, and he will. All right. Well, I think we have 3 more. So I'll try to make them good ones, and I'll see you next time. God bless you. Bye-bye.